Well, I'm acutely aware that I'm your final obstacle between you and lunch. And I'm reminded of these two studies in America where they looked at judges and their rhythm through the day in terms of sentencing, and they found out that judges give harsher sentences right before lunch. So you're my judges, and I will ask you for leniency. So I hope you were kind of intrigued with that title, but in case you weren't, here's a little bit more compelling one. And like all good talks, we're going to start with a graph. And this is from the wonderful Max Roser at Our World in Data. And it's from a 2020 study where they asked a bunch of people, lay people and donors, and a bunch of global health experts, what do you think the range is between the good ones and the not so good ones? And you can see that the donors thought, they're all kind of pretty much the same, maybe a little better. And look what the experts thought. 100 times more effectiveness in the best than the average. But what's really striking is that what they found out, or what their opinion was that half of them sucked. And they're not a good use of money, and some of them are even doing harm. And my friend Gustav calls them the zombies. And if you think about zombies, they wander around the landscape, accomplishing little, but they remain animate as long as they can feast on human flesh. And so if you persuade somebody to fund you for feast on human flesh, you kind of get what Gustav was talking about. In fact, this is, in Zombieland, this is a fundraising drive. And I used to blame them. Like, why don't they try harder? Why don't they get their act together? I don't quite as much now because problem's us, the funders. We're not accountable for impact, and we keep feeding the zombies, and the effects of that echo all the way through the sector. I mean, think about it. Like, somebody like me never gets fired for lack of impact. You can get fired for sleeping with the wrong person, tweeting out the wrong thing, maybe because people just don't like you, but never for the one thing that really matters, impact. So let's just agree on what impact is, or I'll tell you what it is. We think of it as observable material change for the better in the world. That wouldn't have happened otherwise. And that's the cool thing about philanthropy. We get to make good things happen that would not have happened otherwise. And how do you really know when you've had that impact? We think of it as 4 things. Well, first of all, what is impact? Here's a bunch of things that we think are impact, just drawn from our portfolio. These are things you really can see, you really can measure, you really know that the world is a better place. And as usual, it's even more instructive maybe to look at what isn't. Here's the 2 original bullshit metrics. They mean nothing. If anybody brings these to you as a funder, just run. And then impact isn't activities. And then there's this cool stuff that often needs to happen for impact to happen, and it's what makes impact last and grow, but it isn't itself impact. And then, of course, the American response to gun violence is not impact either. And even these things like this are very much steps on the way to impact, but even action isn't impact unless it has that effect. Okay, here's the key to not funding zombies. And I say measure, you could say make a strong case for or authentically know, but don't fund anybody who doesn't. You can't know, and if they don't know, they're flying blind and you will be too. And they don't have what they need to get better at what they do. And so what do they need to know to get better at what they do? What do they need to know to have impact? What do you need to know that they know to have impact? First, know what you're trying to accomplish, measure the right thing, show that change happened, and make sure that it was you. Okay, that first is mission, right? What you're trying to accomplish. Here's your typical mission statement. It's everything and nothing. It doesn't do us any good. We want a mission in 8 words or less. I don't know why, it just seems to work. And we want a verb, a target population, and an outcome that implies something you could observe or measure. So here's from our portfolio. So Blue Ventures helps communities create their own locally managed marine areas. 4 words, I know exactly what they're trying to do. I know what success looks like. I know what failure looks like. Last Mile Health trains professionalized community health workers to work on their own in these remote villages. They started out in Liberia, and now they're working in a number of countries throughout Africa. And then One Acre Fund bundles together the training, inputs, and credit people need to get the most they can out of a little plot. Now that extreme is an interesting modifier because it turns out nobody's going to get into the middle class off of a 1-acre plot. And so we know precisely what they're trying to do here. Well, once you know that, then what does it mean to measure the right thing? We like to ask people, if you could only measure one thing, what would it be? And it always proves to be a useful question to ask, even if it's not actually possible to capture the mission in just one thing, but it's a really good question. Here we have stable fish populations, kind of a technical thing to do, but you know exactly what you're looking for as a funder too. And here it's child mortality, and that's a great measure because if kids aren't dying, they're not as sick, you don't have as much suffering at the kid level, the parent level, the community level. And then here, farm profits. So not just yield, not just revenue, but how much more money do they have in their hand than they wouldn't have had otherwise? The 8-word mission statement is our single most useful tool. And if I sit down in a conversation with a doer and we can't get to that, we're kind of done because the rest of the communication, the rest of the conversation is just going to be confusing. And then showing that a change really happens can be kind of complicated, but fundamentally, it's that you got a baseline and inline. You got a before and an after. And of course, you got to get the right sample size. You got to use state-of-the-art surveying methods to make sure you've got good numbers. But I can't tell you the number of organizations that I've heard say, God, I wish we'd gathered a baseline, because they never got to know exactly what happened. And this is the trickiest part, attribution. Because your impact is the difference between what happened with you minus what would have happened without you. And that what would have happened without you, we refer to as the counterfactual. And I don't have time to go in. It'd be really fun to geek out for an hour on how you get to this. But fundamentally, I just want to make the point of how important it is, which is, here's a good example. So maybe you heard of Millennium Villages, this huge global project where they picked a lot of really poor villages, dumped a ton of resources in them just to see if that could really take them from here to here in a lasting way. And one of the metrics they wanted to use was, well, do they have more cell phones? Because that was sweeping Africa. And in fact, they did. That's a pretty cool looking graph. 10% to, I don't know, more than 40%. They forgot to compare it to anything. And when somebody looked at it, here's the rest of rural Kenya. They accomplished nothing there. Nothing happened that wouldn't have happened otherwise. They can't make that case. Kind of embarrassing. So these 4 things are conceptually fairly simple, but it takes some real skill. It's some work to master them. And so you either, as a funder, you've either got to get good at it yourself, or hire somebody who's really good at it, or follow somebody who's really good at it. You know, like we don't know a ton of people yet down under here, but you know, we know Jasmine Trust over New Zealand, we know Partners in Equity, we know Yajalara. If they told us there was something, excuse me, we should be looking at, we'd take it seriously. And more there's these funds like Co-Impact and Blue Meridian. I mean, we've even created a Malago fund so people who want to follow our portfolio can. They're out there now, and so you can follow somebody else if you don't want to go to all the trouble of doing the stuff yourself. But then what does it mean to actually be accountable then? I keep yammering on about accountability. It means you articulate your approach, you show how you do it, and you show that you do it. And here's a bunch of different approaches. You could do projects and programs, as long as you make sure there's impact and it lasts. You can do research, again, as long as it connects all the way to impact. There's too many, in the world I work, the world of poverty, the world of international development, there's too many academic studies that show a positive result and then never go anywhere. You could do service delivery of proven interventions like mosquito bed nets or vitamin A. You could do what we like to do, scalable solutions, where you take an idea and see what happens if you try to drive it big. You can do system change if you can figure out exactly what that is. And you can do advocacy and policy. Of course you need to do these things. But again, you got to connect the dots all the way to impact. You can mix it up. My friend Mark Cubitt, somewhere in there, and this is paraphrasing, he said to me a long time ago, you know, I like to have a mix. I want some moonshots and I want some slam dunks too. And we at Malago chose what we call scalable solutions. And I feel like I had to hold our feet to the fire and use that as an example for what I mean. So we wanted to say, this is really good, and we want to see if we can create exponential change, because that's what solves problems. So we think of the organizations we fund and that we work with as being on a journey to scale. They start with an idea, and we want to see if we can get to the full potential of that idea. Because that's what scale is. Like, why stop short of that? So it's not just a number, it's taking an idea as far as it can get. And we take them through a set of well-defined stages, R&D, where they get to what they think is a scalable model, and then replication, where they prove its scalability and prove its impact, and then scaling when it really takes off. And that depends usually on the originating organization figuring out who does it at scale. Is it governments? Is it lots of NGOs? Is it businesses? And who the payer might be. Maybe it starts with philanthropy but gets to big aid, or gets to governments funding it, or even gets to customers paying for it. And defining those stages tightly, we can know where what we call the dot is. We know where they are. And then we think about what makes this really take off. It's however you get to your payer at scale. It's however you get to your doer at scale. It's how you use emerging tech. It's what policy you can figure out will open doors or lower barriers. It's about how you achieve collective action, because we all know you don't get there on your own. And that, called the big shift, and the net of that makes our strategy, because strategy is about how you go from here to there. And then we have a tool we call the enoughs. So we can track scalability. So good enough means the impact is big enough to matter in people's lives. Not just a tiny increment, but something consequential. And we've got good enough, we've got rigorous evidence for it, and we've got a case that it's going to last. And then big enough means the overlap of where it's needed and where it was worked is big enough to be interesting. Simple enough is simple enough that that doer can do it. And cheap enough is cheap enough that that payer can pay it. And so we can actually graph that out where it's persuasive enough to keep going, rigorous enough to scale. And we sit down with the organization, we say, well, where are you now? And at intervals, we revisit that. Are we making progress on these things? Are we ready to scale? And so having done that, we can be accountable for the movement towards scale. And at any point, we can estimate the numbers of impact. And that simple thing of tracking the dot is something we now do throughout our portfolio. And we get into something when we believe we can get all the way to full potential. We stay in with unrestricted funding as long as we think we might get there still, and we get out when it becomes clear we can't. And this proves to be a really satisfying way to fund. My team and I have such a good time with this. It's getting some skin in the game makes it way more interesting. I like to surf big waves, and I like to climb mountains. I was an emergency doctor. I had zero interest in philanthropy. It seemed kind of dull. This is really fun. This is really satisfying. I left behind medicine. I had a good time. I loved it. This is better. And what's really good about accountability for impact, it creates a more equal dynamic with the doers. You can't get rid of all the asymmetry, but it's way more equal. And if you're accountable for impact, you're as grateful to them for their impact as they are for your money. You're now interdependent. And you can be real partners instead of lip service partners. I mean, everybody in this room knows that the doers feel like they have to bullshit us sometimes. And that reminds me of the best piece of philanthropic advice I ever got. One of my board members goes, Kevin, now that you're a funder, everybody's going to tell you you're a genius. You are not a genius. And we've got a lot of long overdue reforms in philanthropy right now. And we need one big one to go along with it, to accompany them all, because lasting impact is the ultimate expression of justice and love of humanity, for that matter. And it seems like we're hearing more and more about more giving. You know, every time somebody joins the giving pledge, it makes the hose of money go that much bigger. But that doesn't matter if it's not pointed in the right way. I don't know where this kid's pointing it, but I doubt it's the right way. You know, a crusty old patient of mine said, size don't matter if it ain't doing the right thing. And we need that money to be going in the right direction. And there is movement toward that. There's a lot of us trying to do it. There's a lot of people in this room trying to do it. And look, the Nobel Prize Committee even got in on it. This is our friend Esther Duflo getting a Nobel Prize for applying scientific rigor to social interventions for a deeper exploration of impact. But we don't have critical mass yet. This isn't the norm in philanthropy. We need it to be. You know that you've all heard that old thing, the best time to plant a tree was 20 years ago, the next best time is today. If we'd made ourselves accountable impact a long time ago, we'd have a world where resources flow efficiently to those most able to create change, where the zombies starved a long time ago, where the biggest reputational risk as a funder was you didn't make impact happen. The second best day is today. We're there. Let's go. Thank you.
So if you've got the app, feel free to submit a question. Thanks, Kevin. As somebody who's spent much of my career doing research and evaluation, we could just have this Q&A, but I'm throwing to the audience. We have a first question here. How do you attribute impact in a space where there are a number of players and initiatives at play?
That's such a good question. And I think it's where you may not be able to apportion out the impact, the credit. And the nice thing is credit is kind of a non-zero-sum game. But each organization involved needs to know what its contribution needed to be and measure the degree to which they contributed to that in terms of their own impact. So you can have a whole bunch of organizations working on the same thing, and the net of their work in concert, is something that would be really hard to attribute to any one of them, but they should be accountable for their contribution to that larger achievement.
Good answer. I love the whole how do we think about contribution within a broader attribution point. I think that's actually a really nice place to land. I have another question that's just come in from Daisy. What advice do you have for evaluating the impact of advocacy?
Oh, that's such a good one, because I think it's in its infancy, but I think it can be done. And the first question I ask anybody who's doing that is, okay, what do you want people to do differently? Because you can observe that, and then you can ask, and then. Years ago, I had this kid who was starting an organization to get people to divest from Sudan in order to stop genocide. And he just thought intuitively that was a great idea. And I said to him, well, what about the bad guys? How does that lead to the bad guys not doing bad stuff? And he couldn't connect the dots all the way. And it's that connecting of the dots all the way to the change you really want to see that helps us figure out how would we first try to predict if this thing will work, and second of all, start monitoring those dots all the way to the final impact, the final result.
On something that you said in your speech, you said, don't fund anyone who doesn't measure impact. Something that I'm acutely aware of is inequity in the not-for-profit space. So what happens when you have an amazing organisation doing amazing work, but they don't have the skills, the resources to measure their impact? How do you deal with that?
I think most organizations should be spending about 10% of their budget measuring their impact and monitoring what they do. And if they're that awesome, they should be able to raise the money to do it, and they should apportion the money to do it. And it's money really well spent, because it's almost certainly the case that they're going to achieve a whole lot more if they do. Again, if you're not measuring stuff, it's like a company not measuring profit. How would they get better at making profit if they didn't even measure it?
And I think from a philanthropy's perspective, our role in this, how do we pay for that? Pay what it takes in terms of paying for
give them
measuring
unrestricted
impact.
money and make sure they measure. Or if they ask you for money just to measure, give them that. But that's why we do unrestricted funding, is so that you can say, okay, what are your priorities? What are your needs? You're going to apportion where you see best. If I didn't think you knew better than I do how to use your money, then I wouldn't even fund you. And so make it a budget item and do it.
A question from Susie Riddell. How have you built learning mechanisms within your team and the partnerships to help identify whether you keep going with something or whether you stop funding it on that scaling journey?
Well, first of all, you're a little patient, because the real world is tough and it's chaotic. But essentially, all those parameters you heard me talk about, we're watching them all and we're tracking them, and we're making a consensus judgment on whether we think this thing is going to happen or not. And you can't make that on the basis of 1 year or 2 years, sometimes not even 3. It's a longer-term trend. But either the big randomized controlled trial said the thing didn't work, or you see chronic management problems that just don't seem like they're ever going to get fixed, or God knows what. But the key, I think, for us is having objective criteria all the time. Like one of the things I wanted Malaga to be able to do was tell somebody exactly why you're not a fit, exactly why we're going to fund you, or exactly why we're not going to fund you more, because that seemed like the most respectful thing to the doers. But in the end, it's having an objective framework to judge, a smart team you can come to consensus judgment on with.
I've got a couple of, I'm going to combine, I'm going to be asked to wrap in a minute, so I'm going to combine two questions into one. One is, can you give us an example, there's been a couple of questions around this, can you give us an example of something that you have funded that's gone from small to scalable with great impact? And secondly, how do you as a foundation measure your own impact?
Great questions. So first of all, like the thing that's worked out best for us, the thing I'm most proud of, is we funded a bunch of organizations that independently had this idea of professionalized community health workers. In other words, the norm had always been volunteers, and study after study showed it didn't work. And the only way we're going to get to universal health care, universal primary care, is if we get community health workers doing something effective. So several organizations, like the Last Mile Health example I used, decided we're going to professionalize them. We're going to pay them and certify them. We're going to train them really well in a broader set of things. We're going to make sure they're supplied well, and we're going to put them in an effective supervisory structure. And then, in the various countries that we're working, Togo, Mali, Kenya, Rwanda, they got together and created this meta-level organization called the Community Health Impact Coalition, or CHIC. And CHIC started being a platform for shared practice, coordinated and shared research agenda, lobbying for policy change, lobbying for more funding. That whole thing is now scaling up with a bunch of different governments. And so that's an example of exactly what we've tried to do. What was the second part of the question?
How do you measure your own impact?
Their impact is our impact. And we can't say exactly what our impact was. We can look at, and money's fungible, and so we don't really care if our money is special or not. We just want to make sure all our money is going into something good. And so we keep track. We have a fellows program where we first start to work with these founders, and we keep track of how many of the fellows that start actually get into the portfolio, who's still in the portfolio at 5 years. And increasingly, because it takes a long time to get to scale, and the sector isn't very good at getting people there, so we're still looking at what it's going to take to really get a bunch of stuff up here. But we know that about 70% of our fellows get into the portfolio, and at 5 years, about 70% of those are still in the portfolio. So that's about 50% that went into the starting gate and are still making it down the track.
Well, I have to say there's going to be a lot of people that are going to be after you at lunchtime, because there are a lot of questions that have now come through on this sheet, one of which I'm going to pre-warn you on, so you can think about this between now and getting to the back of the room and fighting for your lunch, which is, what do you think systems change is? So let me leave that with you, and please join me in thanking Kevin Starr.